Welcome to the PI Podcast Question and Answer Show.
PI nyo.
Ooh. Nakakatakot naman, Borge. Yes, PI nyo, where we take your questions and we answer them. All right. And then this week, we have a very interesting one because normally in our show, we would recommend things to watch, movies and books, whatever. But this time, a listener recommended us to watch something that's interesting. So do you have the fan mail, Borge?
Yeah. It's a shout out to one of our PIs, Kevin Duwayan. According to him, hello, Kevin. He actually pitched a topic. He said that he would like to hear a review or discussion of Shin Godzilla by Hideaki Anno, since it's kind of a giant monster movie with some political elements on it. Also, no one talks about the political side of that movie. So it's not really a question, but more of a recommendation. So we are here to give our insights on this thoroughly entertaining movie. As far as I'm concerned. So yeah.
Yeah. And it's weird because the fact that he said that, because it's almost impossible not to see the political sides. Of course, whenever there's a standard giant monster movie attack, you'd always see the president's men and the army scrambling and discussing. But really, it's all about the unleashing missiles and ships and planes against the monster, and it's spectacle. But oddly enough, this particular movie didn't have a lot of that. A quick summary of it is really Godzilla comes in and attacks Japan as usual, and people respond to it. It's people responding to it. But that's the basic plot. But what's different from the other Godzilla movies that we are used to? Before we get into that, have you been exposed to Godzilla media before, Borge?
Yeah. I've watched the earlier Godzilla during the 90s when they made Godzilla look more like a T-Rex, which is amusing. I think I was planning to watch Godzilla versus King Kong. I'm about to find
the latest one.
Yeah. Other than that, yeah.
You're talking about the 1998, 1997
I think so.
version of Godzilla, starring Matthew Broderick.
He looked more like a T-Rex.
I do love that, actually. It's not the same as the Japanese Godzilla, which is a man in a rubber suit who has been fighting monsters ever since and fighting and destroying paper mache buildings the whole time. In fact, it's more of a product of the Japanese consciousness, because not only is it I'm not sure if it still is, but it's one of the winners of the Guinness World Record for longest film franchise since dating back to let me check this, the 1950s, I think. 1963, 4, I think. So it's a long time, longer than James Bond or longer than Star Wars. So it has always usually been like that. It's a basic government versus monster, and sometimes monster versus monster, and sometimes Godzilla versus King Kong, as we said. And before that, there's Godzilla King Monsters, where he fought against the three-headed monster. Ghidorah, was it? I can't remember. It has its own lore. It has its own universe, and I think it's a huge thing. But this one is particularly different. And what have you noticed? We watched this together, actually. So, what did you notice that's different from our expectations?
Well, two things. First, again, spoiler alert to those who haven't watched Shin Godzilla, but again, we recommend that you watch it. But Godzilla arrived in the picture not in the traditional way of emerging out of the waters as a fully, the giant. The giant that we know. He slowly evolved through the entire movie, which is, of course, we would analyze that one later on, which is crucial to understanding the entire plot and political thrust of the movie. Second one is, how many minutes did we actually see Godzilla in the entire movie? It's a 2-hour film. It's a 2-hour film. I think Godzilla his shenanigans only comprised 10-15 minutes of it. So most of it was about government people having meetings. So
it was Bureaucracy, the movie. If you notice with the promos, we called it Max Weber versus Godzilla. Why is that? Because basically Max Weber is famous for writing about the bureaucracy, which was slow, a slow office it's a bunch of series of office meetings, and it's literally we were laughing at the part where the transition was like just the same people in the same meeting going to a different room in a different meeting. That's the context. Maybe, oh, there's a new set of officials, but really it's just people from moving one office to another, and it's almost hilarious if it wasn't so tragic, because as a result of the bureaucracy, Godzilla was rampaging almost unimpeded. He was just going out willy-nilly, and he looked real. The first, you said he was he was evolving. The first form looked very derpy. He had googly eyes and he had soft
Derpzilla.
skin, and Derpzilla, who's crawling on all fours. So he seemed very vulnerable. And if they fired like a couple of missiles, that'll be the movie. That's it. But no, they just said, "What should we do?" And they even talked about the thing, how they respond. Maybe they consulted the scientific community first, and they basically said things that they already kind of knew, and they didn't know that he's an iguana or he's a mutant and all that. So really, I think the main point of that is because of government structures and red tape and meetings, it actually prevented them from having a immediate response to the monster, which if they responded more quickly, then they would have gotten rid of Godzilla. But no, they waited for him to move 2 or 3 forms and transformations.
No, yeah, that's the thing. Godzilla, in this, again, contrary to the usual emergence of Godzilla as a fully formed creature, again, he evolved through the entire thing. And again, he started more as a blob, started more as a red blob above the stinking underpass, the tunnel,
Right.
the underwater tunnel. Started as a blob, then the meetings occurred because the blob is red and steaming. And the meetings occurred, they had meetings for hours, then it became a large tail. Then that's another thing. That's why we raise Max Weber here, because Max Weber, if you're familiar with his works, he argued that the government, the bureaucracy, as a series of offices, should be to an extent isolated from society. So there were already videos coming from citizens showing that there's a massive tail emerging out of the waters. And one of the comments of the government officials is basically, we need to confirm if the videos are actually authentic. Jesus, there were hundreds of citizens already watching it unfold. So, yeah, government meetings, so on and so forth. So they basically just spent hours trying to identify what on God's name it is and what are the financial costs of trying to resolve it, since the tunnel is expensive. So they were bombarded by they were bombarding the prime minister with multiple economic and political problems surrounding it, while the problem itself involves. And I think this would be my first point regarding the movie. If you watch Shin Godzilla, Godzilla itself embodies what a policy problem looks like. It is what a policy problem looks like.
It's a metaphor.
How it evolved through the movie. I think the best thing that we can compare to it would be from Machiavelli. So, according to Machiavelli, the problem that is easiest to resolve are the problems that are harder to identify. So they don't know what on God's name Godzilla was during it. Godzilla was still vulnerable. They could have just bombed the damn thing and he would have disappeared. But it was hard to identify, except for one of the entity, except for one of the protagonists who actually believed that this is a threat. Other than him, everyone else was having a hard time trying to identify. Well, for Machiavelli, of course, if it's hard to identify, it's easier to resolve. It is harder to resolve once it's easier to identify. So basically, when Godzilla was already that raging monster, he's already harder to eliminate. So yeah, it's basically a policy problem.
I do want to react to one thing said. First of all, I mean, the fact that people were already showing videos and posting them on the internet and saying, is this real? And in the real world, it is healthy and okay to doubt the authenticity of something, especially if it's highly irregular. Like in this world, especially in the world of adults, we are so cynical. It's like, there's no such thing as ghosts or monsters or demons or whatever. And yet there's one standing, like staring at you in the face, waving its tail, saying hello, and still we don't believe it. And I think that's the government response to a lot of things when people say things, especially things of the supernatural or regular occurrence. In fact, I think, especially when we talk about the bureaucracy is designed to be a machine to respond to regular and ordinary processes and problems. Now, when it encounters something that is irregular, something that is supernatural even, or basically highly
Extraordinary.
irregular, extraordinary, then it's immobilized.
Hmm.
It has to process things like what you said, and instead of just acting, it just tries to categorize it. And it took like what, 10 minutes of like meetings to decide what to do. Is it like a disaster problem, or is it a military problem? And it took a very long time. And typical, you know, typical movies like this, they would have sent submarines or tanks, but
It's the
we saw
Western.
them in like what, yeah, in the 30-minute mark. And even then they didn't even shoot. They even asked like, sir, should we fire? Sir, should we fire? It's funny if you notice, there's the quick cuts saying, sure, sir, should we fire? Sir, should we fire? And this in Japanese, of course. I said, oh, is there people left? And yes, and there's a shot of like one or two people walking in the background. It's like, oh, let's not shoot. It's like, oh no. In fact, I could have called this like blue balls in the movie, because my god, they were like setting up the tanks and the helicopters, about to shoot their things, and it's like poof. So it's like,
I think
why won't you just shoot it? Yeah.
the film only took a few minutes regarding those meetings, but as far as the subtitles are concerned, it actually took hours. So it took hours for Godzilla to evolve. And again, regarding the doubt regarding the incapacity of a large bureaucracy to deal with extraordinary, again, being isolated from society, their citizens are already filming and streaming Godzilla's evolution live. So, and it's not only one source. It's just, there were shots of hundreds of people at the Bay area, at the riverbank area, actually just watching Godzilla, filming it on their cell phones. Yet the bureaucracy could not believe it, because again, they're encumbered by multiple concerns. You have economic concerns, you have fiscal concerns, you have political concerns, you have security concerns. Who on God's name should lead the damn thing? Which is also a curious. They're also asking, who's going to lead this thing? Is it supposed to be the military or the civilian force?
I mean, it's very rare to have like a Japanese movie be like deadpan humor, because it feels like a deadpan comedy or dark comedy. Like Godzilla's rampaging there, and you're like, oh, who's gonna head the committee? Oh yeah. Anyway,
it's just, I think it's also reflective of Japan's trauma regarding militarism. That's why it did not move to the military immediately. So again, Godzilla itself is an embodiment of trauma for decades.
I mean, it's funny because this movie is almost as if it was designed to teach Japanese high school or even university students like about the system of government they have, and like be pissed off at it, because it's if you notice, like there are not a lot of emergencies, quote unquote. Like it's more or less fine until it's not. Like, and whenever you see there's an emergency, it's usually a nuclear reactor or like a earthquake or a tsunami. That's why it's a Japanese word, tsunami, for like huge wave. So I don't know, like that's so yeah, it's definitely heavily embedded in the Japanese context. And one that we mentioned is the military. And like while America and other, of course, countries are trigger happy with their military, the Japanese have a self-defense force, not a proper army. Now, if you can talk more about that particular thing, and we can learn from this.
Again, after the Second World War, Japan demilitarized, so they organized the self-defense force, which for the longest time could not take any offensive action whatsoever. And of course,
not even against Godzilla.
Of course, civilian control. So again, the Japanese political system was founded on a history of militarism. Even radical militarists existed in Japan before the Second World War. But the thing is, just an update. They had some constitutional changes earlier on, so Japan could now take offensive action in support of its allies. So that's a reason change in the self-defense, the nation's self-defense force. So, but yeah, you're right. You're correct. This is basically a film that gives you an overview of how Japanese politics and bureaucratic processes works. So
yeah,
so they're also talking about who's the party secretary, who's the next party secretary, who would succeed this one. So, Jesus.
Right. And if you know, like speaking of the context, I think the first thing that actually damaged Godzilla was, and maybe we could talk about this, is the fact that American stealth bombers were the ones that launched the missiles that actually hurt Godzilla. So is there some sort of like Well, and this also talks about not only the Japanese system, but how it relates to the international world.
Mm.
Even then, like when the Americans eventually failed, they actually gave Japan 2 weeks before they would actually nuke it again. And that actually was very important because the trauma of like the atomic bomb hitting Japan was embedded into its system and society and memory. And the fact that in the second half of the film, when Godzilla eventually released its atomic breath and suddenly, cooled down, went to airplane mode, they're now saying that, oh, the Americans will now send a nuke but people don't want another another bombing into, especially at the heart of Japan. In fact, it's funny because even in 1954, that's the first Godzilla movie. It came out of the context of that anxiety wherein, because of the radiation of the atomic bomb at first, apparently they were afraid that certain creatures would emerge because of the mutations it had, and Godzilla is one of them. Eventually, sometimes Godzilla became like, there's some movies that featured him as the good guy fighting on behalf of humanity, fighting against other monsters. But really, Godzilla himself is a monster created precisely out of that nuclear, context.
Yes.
So, what can you say about that trauma?
So the trauma is there, and even Godzilla itself, the Shin Godzilla, is already a nuclear actor in its own. So again, Japan has a curious relationship with nuclear power. So it's traumatized by nuclear weapons, but it has harnessed nuclear power for the longest time. And I think that's also what the background story of Shin Godzilla was, of course, the doctor who actually discovered his existence, or probably triggered his existence, because he is the key to having eternal or sustainable power, because he himself is Godzilla evolved into a self-sustaining nuclear reactor. The first part, Godzilla went back to the sea to cool down. But the next evolution is that he's already self-sustaining, doesn't need to go back to the sea, doesn't need any coolants. So, but then again, they're traumatized by nuclear weapon usage. So even if the international community, by the way, the first half of the movie is about local domestic politics and bureaucracy.
Yes.
Well, it transitions slowly to second part, which is IR. So the second part, the international community already offered them support after nuking Godzilla. But again, it further dragged the nerds to propose an alternative. Yeah, what can you say about the nerds, by the way? It's a battle. It's basically nerds versus Godzilla.
Oh yeah, in fact, that's what we said in the caption of our ad. It's basically poli-sci nerds or policy nerds versus Godzilla, and would be like, it's like a career day for poli-sci majors. So basically, it's people like you and me against a giant kaiju. So would we win? Probably not, because there's so many processes. And it's funny to put it in their perspective, because they just want to just do problem solving, almost like basic, straightforward problem solving. You see, there's a monster that can be a threat. You throw missiles at it. That's probably one thing that America might get right. Shoot, then ask questions later, especially if it's not human. But I do want to lead this to the next question, because it's through their perspective. Basically, they're competent. They are pencil pushers. In fact, it's surprisingly it features a large number of Xerox machines, which is odd. That's their greatest weapon against Godzilla. It's Xerox machines, not bullets. But definitely, it puts you into perspective people who are acting within that system, but are powerless to do more than that. And so we move on to, first, they were more or less just pencil pushers. They're just middle managers, etc. They're just researchers. Eventually, it shifted from the first. It can be divided into two movies: before and after Godzilla uses atomic breath and cool down. So during that time, they were able to shift gears. And so I wanted to discuss, of course, what didn't work in the first half, because the first half represent a kind of regime, and what actually worked in the second half, and what made them able to beat Godzilla in the second half. So what do you think really changed? And eventually, and spoiler alert, in the end, they actually beat Godzilla. So what do you think? What can we actually learn from that transition to the second half, where they actually beat Godzilla?
I think, again, the difference in regimes and difference in leadership We can look at it from two perspectives. So again,
Right.
to our POLSCI listeners or those who are
Mm.
concerned with governance, so you have the
Right.
traditional public ad, traditional public
Public
ad.
ad half of the
Yeah,
movie.
public ad half. The first half would be you have the traditional public admin and even traditional governance, which is they consulted biologists who actually they just said that it's unknown. So basically, they just confirmed that it's unknown.
Mhm.
He consulted different sectors of the government, so on and so forth. So it's basically practice public administration. So you have there, they tried to tackle the question of Godzilla, the evolving Godzilla, from a public financial perspective
Weird.
and from a political perspective. So they were discussing expenses and political impacts. So
Mm.
so that's that. And I think also you also have the intertwinement of public admin with party politics there,
Mhm.
because the protagonist is actually
Right.
a protege of an undersecretary. I
Mhm.
think, if I'm not mistaken, the
So he's an
undersecretary.
ASEC.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
undersecretary is preventing him from speaking out his mind, but to an
Mhm.
extent, the undersecretary paved the way for an establishment of a separate committee for him.
Mm.
So nagkaroon ng overlap dun eh. So you have the traditional public admin run by the godforsaken prime minister and the
Right.
oldies, the old
Yeah.
people, while they have the smaller committee organized by the nerds,
Right.
also nerds,
Mhm.
try to formulate a solution to it. So
Mm.
nagkaroon ng overlap. And then
Right.
Godzilla used the atomic breath, finally killing the prime minister. So may nagkaroon ng political vacuum.
Or basically all the upper echelon of
Yeah, the
well,
old
the
people.
old guard, right?
Yeah.
It's funny. I think you mentioned this point after we watched it, but the people that died, the prime minister, the first
Mm.
prime minister and his main cabinet, were mostly party politicians. So,
Yeah.
like what you said, they measure their moves according to budget and if they have anything left for like the future, which is like that's the last thing you should think about if you're having like a rampaging monster. Just throw everything, shoot it until it's dead, and now you don't wait until like, oh, red tape process, defense forces. So why? And then eventually later on you have the people that died and people that replaced him, and that I think you mentioned that he was that the new prime minister is actually interesting. What can you compare with the old and new prime minister? He was replaced by just an old guy. It's almost comical, but do you find him important?
Yeah, you're regarding that one. The first prime minister was again the traditional party politician. He wants to get reelected, so on and so forth. So he wants to again traditional bureaucrat. While the succeeding prime minister was Minister of Agriculture. So actually, the protagonist said that he is the most
senior,
not senior, but he's not supposed to be there as a prime minister because he's unqualified, because he's basically Minister of Agriculture. So, but he's the only one left, and
that's because he's the most senior, or the
first,
oldest.
the one left. But one thing is, the first few shots of that old prime minister was again it shows that he doesn't know what he's doing. But the difference between him and the old prime minister is that the new one knows how to listen to the experts, and he knows how to process to an extent. And the old one doesn't have anything to lose. That's another key factor in the entire plot. The old prime minister, the new prime minister is too old that he doesn't have anything to lose. He's about to retire. Well, the dead prime minister, the previous prime minister, was he has things to lose. He has things to take care of, and he doesn't know how to listen to advice. So that's basically two types of Machiavellian leaders. So the worst type is someone who doesn't know how to listen and who doesn't know how to think. Well, I think the second type would be the new prime minister, which is he doesn't know how to think. He doesn't have his own original ideas, but he knows how to listen.
But if you notice in the end of the film, he did have a big role because he was able to buy some time before the Americans would bomb them. He actually, he was seen bowing to, I think, France, and France helped them by time. And this is for Japanese society a big thing, to humble oneself, especially if you're a leader in front of like perhaps a foreign power. So he knew, like what you said, he knew that he had nothing else to lose, so might as well lose face and be humble enough to ask for help. So that's so in other words, when faced with an emergency, you don't think about your political career, you just go and act. That's funny. Like, again, you look at the protagonist again. Like, he eventually he was an assistant secretary, and now he eventually was head of the operation. What do you notice about the difference between the sequence? Like, for instance, like people in the way the old prime minister handled the operation with versus the protagonist who is who is this the ASEC? Is there a difference in that?
Is there a difference between them? I think the ASEC, the protagonist is actually the best type of Machiavellian leader, the one who can think on his own and who can actually process other people's inputs, because he actually consulted the different entities to create a solution. But last thoughts on the new prime minister, which is I find that scene very striking. It's a very brief scene, so just about a few seconds, because the UN Security Council could not decide because France is withholding its vote. So France withheld its vote to nuke Godzilla because the prime minister bowed to, again, basically bowed to the French ambassador as far as I'm concerned. So I don't think it's not the French prime minister or president. He's basically just the ambassador. It's too desperate. But regarding the protagonist, it's the prototype of Napoleon's rise to power. Napoleon more or less was skyrocketed to power simply because the old people disappeared. There are no old generals who came into office. So this protagonist is a combination of good governance and political ambition, because he also wants to be prime minister. So those are the final parts of the stinking movie. He actually exposed his political ambitions. So again, public service. I think this more or less quells any idealistic nonsense. Public service is not about purity of intent. It's about getting your intentions aligned with the public good. He is politically ambitious like anyone else, but he knows how to do shit.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's okay to be ambitious as long as you get results. To get the job done is basically what he did.
Yeah.
And if you notice, for me, the difference in that scene is that he was just he's barking orders, and it's like, oh, launch the brains, kaboom, fire, kaboom, kaboom, kaboom. Anyway, and yeah, he was.
They force-fed Godzilla.
Yeah, like a trip to the dentist, because my God, his teeth was horrible, and it just put the coolant. It's not even that spectacular. It's just like they just injected coolant into his mouth, like in the dentist's office. My God. But it's a great watch. It's very visual, but again, it involves a lot of science, both hard science and political science. Now, I suppose we can. Well, by the way, the protagonist's name is Hiroki Hasegawa. His character is Brando Yaguchi, but it's not that clear with the way that the movie was set. It was just really spectacle and meeting, etc. So it's really
daming Xerox machine.
Oh yeah, so many Xerox machines. So I suppose we should probably close this the discussion with, of course, this is Japan. A lot of it can only happen in the Japanese context. It's about a commentary of the Japanese political system. Yes, and I think in the way the movie was received is had universal acclaim in Japan, but didn't really do well everywhere else. Now, as observers in political science, is there anything that we can learn from this Japanese context? Especially here, how the political system deals with emergencies, say, for instance, in natural disasters, or perhaps COVID and the pandemic, which is painfully obvious. Like this, there's always almost a clear allegory. So what do you think?
Well, I think the comparison is a bit simple. At least in the case of Shin Godzilla, the protector or the patron of the protagonist was able to form a relatively effective committee for his protege to work in, to innovate. But in the Philippines, we don't have such things. So, buti pa sila. In the Philippines, there's very little space to innovate here, unless you're a local government leader. Even if you're a local government leader, the national government bash you if you deviate from plans. So yeah, Shin Godzilla is basically like COVID in the Philippines.
Yeah.
If you would look at
if you don't act fast, it will grow into something that's harder to fight, and you'll fight forever.
And it would have a face of being dirt. We had that. Actually, the face of derp COVID here in the Philippines.
Derp COVID. Oh, we even had a mascot. Yeah,
putang ina yun.
Yeah. I suppose it's the one thing that I do admire, at least with the what's his name, Rando Yaguchi, I think is what his name is. Uh, yeah, he acted without.
Mm,
He was almost well, of course, because the old guard was dead. He was granted more authority and freedom to act.
mm,
But in when in a emergency situation, you do not think about the it's you don't think about the budget or whether or not this will benefit you in the next election. You
mm,
simply do as much as you can and provide results for the people. I think that's one thing that's simple. Even like, of course, disregarding the possibility of like angering your patrons, because especially with COVID, people thought it was from China, and people were saying like maybe blocked from China, but maybe that's not the point. The point
mm,
is actually to control movement regardless of where it came from, whether it came from China or not. But that didn't happen for some
mm,
reason. So if we acted swiftly and were able to react to
mm,
new problems and new emergencies, then we would not have this big problem of a Godzilla or a big pandemic. So the lessons of Godzilla are painfully clear, at least to me, especially in
mm,
this pandemic. So in terms of governance, there are times when you have to follow the rules and in regular, ordinary situations. But if not, then might as well be flexible and should be adjust. You should,
mm,
in fact, if I remember correctly,
mm.
one of the lessons of Machiavelli is to adjust to fortuna. Am I right? So if you can
Yeah.
say, yeah, to adjust to the unexpected.
Mm.
Mhm.
So yeah, I do agree with that one. But I think my
Uh-huh.
final note regarding the protagonist, which is simple. Political ambition is not mutually exclusive with good governance.
Mm.
The key is to align your political ambition with
Mm-hmm.
a clear, measurable, and appropriate sense of what the public good is. Because the prime
Mm.
minister, the old prime minister who more or less got disintegrated, he had a sense of public good. He wanted to
Mm-hmm.
evacuate people. He had
Mm.
the public good of sustaining budget. He had the public good
Mm-hmm.
of keeping expenses down or more or less not causing any panic. But those
Mm-hmm.
are senses of public. Those are interpretations of the public good that are not appropriate to the emergency. They're not
Mm-hmm.
aligned with the emergency. So yun ang pinakaiba
Right.
nila eh. So he's also concerned about the public good. Pero hindi akma. unlike
Mm-hmm.
unlike the protagonist, his interpretation of the public good is actually just to eliminate the emergency.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
yun. And of course, Foresight, he's one of the first ones to actually say that blob is a threat. even if it's
So
even if it's a
fire
blob,
at it.
even if it's a
Yeah.
blob. So
Mhm.
yeah. So they're not
Yeah.
mutually exclusive. Political ambition is
Right.
not mutually exclusive with governance.
Right. And it's funny because, of course, the contrast is clear. The career politicians are old,
Mm,
while he is more or less young, so he can act on instinct. So I think that's well, of course, the second prime minister is an old. He redeemed the old, but in
mm,
the end, I suppose it's good to be young,
mm,
instinctive, and react. It's so sometimes that's what it takes to beat Godzilla.
mm.
Sometimes he starts out as a small problem, and you fight him as a small problem before it becomes a big problem. So
Mm.
yeah, I don't now.
It's
Now,
mm,
we have to be clear. This is not a extensive review of like basically the genre of
the
Godzilla. We don't know
franchise.
how different. This is a long franchise, but these are our insights as we saw it, as someone
Mm,
with fresh eyes, almost like
mm.
we barely even watched the new ones. Like, so it's
Yeah,
basically just spectacle, but this one is really a critique of the system. So
yeah.
yeah,
And again, it's good to know a bit more about Japanese history if you before
Mhm.
watching Godzilla
Right.
a bit more. The thing is, I think the last point regarding Japanese
Right.
politics.
Mm.
Japanese politics have a curious relationship with innovation and tradition. As always
Right.
say, it's usually embodied by specific people who are traditionally supposed to be there, but in terms of innovation, they're not supposed to be there. I think one of the actors,
Mhm.
one of the Japanese ministers, the old ones.
Right.
I actually know the actor
You
from another
recognize him?
movie. Yeah, I recognize him from
Huh.
another movie. In another movie, he played the part of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. I think this Midway, the movie
Oh
Midway.
wow. Who's
Chuichi
that?
Nagumo, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo believed in the primacy of battleships, but he commanded aircraft carriers. So it's basically out of place. He basically caused the
Huh.
destruction of the Japanese fleet in the Battle of Midway because it's
Mm.
not
Oh
supposed to be
my.
there. But he's senior. He's senior. So
Uh huh.
the naval chief Yamamoto had no choice but to put him there. So
Right.
so yeah. Anyway, just a keen as a side note. Nakita na kita dati and you're also causing the same problems.
I don't know. I mean, well, one thing's for sure: if Godzilla attacked us, we would be doomed. But even bureaucracy or not, but at the very least, at least Japan has a functioning and coherent bureaucracy, even though in the situation, it was completely useless at the time. So yes, you got to be impressed with the attention to detail. Like you talked about the cost of bullets and the cost of like for the traffic jams, etc. So
a lot
of policy terms. A lot of policy terms. So yeah. So do you recommend to watch this?
Yeah, for nerds, high recommendation.
Oh yeah, especially poli-sci majors.
Yeah.
For regular audiences, it's a bit of a hard watch because if you have to get the joke.
Yeah.
And the joke is it's a commentary about the inefficiency of bureaucracy. And that is not, it's a very educated joke. So but as in terms of spectacle, expect a bit less spectacle.
Yeah.
It is a spectacle contextualized with structures and politics.
Yeah. So
both international and local. So
for poli-sci majors out there, if you're still asking what's the purpose of your degree, well, at least you can answer that you can defeat Godzilla with it.
Or at least learn to adjust, because
you can beat Godzilla with your degree.
They did use politics, but at least more responsive to emergencies and not rigid politics. So thank you, Kevin, for that recommendation. And if everyone else has any other insights about Godzilla, feel free to contact us. Or even if you have more questions or podcast
movies to recommend,
movies recommends, books recommends, and we would be happy to review and discuss it with you. And please send it to us at pipodcastph@gmail.com. And you can catch our other episodes as usual on Spotify, Anchor, and YouTube. But until the next PI nyo,
magandang gabi, mga ka-PI.